Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say every family has secrets, but in this one the secret wasn't whispered in the kitchen or hidden in a locked drawer. It was walking around the farm in plain sight, smiling at the neighbors, holding hands where no one dared to look too long. If you drive far enough out past the broken mills and abandoned tracks in West Virginia, there's a road the locals won't name. It's not on any map, not officially, but it's there. A narrow strip of cracked asphalt that disappears into a valley where the sunlight feels wrong. It's where the oldest families settled, where names and bloodlines fold back in on themselves like pages stuck together. It was there, in the fall of 1932, that a girl named Eleanor married a man named Thomas. The church bells rang, the guests clapped politely, and no one mentioned the fact that Eleanor had shared a crib with her husband years before either of them could walk. Because Eleanor and Thomas weren't just from the same family tree, they were from the same branch. She was his younger sister. This isn't rumor, it's documented. The dusty marriage certificate still exists, buried in the county records, stamped and signed like it was any other union. But behind that piece of paper is a story so strange and so unsettling that even the descendants still won't speak of it. Neighbors remember how Thomas was the quiet one, always watching from the porch while Eleanor worked the yard, always standing just a little too close. They say it was their father's idea, a way to keep the blood pure. But purity is a strange word when it means tearing up the natural boundaries of love and kinship, sewing them back together into something warped, something that doesn't fit right. When the Depression came, families clung together, but the family in the valley, they clung too tightly, and what happened inside that farmhouse would cast a shadow long after the last candle was blown out. Because when you marry your sister, the children you bring into the world carry more than just your name. The first child was born on a cold March morning when the frost clung to the windows like lace. His name was Samuel, though in the old family Bible it's written as Samuel, as if even the ink was in a hurry to move past him. The midwife who delivered him left the valley that same week. Some say she was offered better pay in the next county. Others say she simply couldn't bear to be in that house again, not after what she'd seen in the boy's eyes. They were a shade of pale grey, almost colourless, like water pulled from a deep well, and there was something else, something she couldn't name, but would carry with her until her own deathbed. The second child came less than 2 years later, a girl, Margaret. She was smaller, quieter, and she didn't cry much, which the neighbours thought was a blessing. But silence in a child can feel like an omen, and those who saw her up close spoke of a peculiar stillness in her, a way of watching people without blinking, as if she was memorizing their faces for reasons no one wanted to imagine. It was around this time that whispers began to spread, not from gossiping housewives or petty neighbors, but from the doctor who'd been called out to the farm more than once. He had a way of speaking in careful, measured tones, never accusing, but his words lingered like smoke. Some lines, he once told the sheriff quietly, shouldn't be crossed. Nature has ways of pushing back. Thomas didn't take kindly to those kinds of comments. He was a large man, slow to speak, but quick to anger. When a traveling preacher stopped by one summer and mentioned the dangers of the mixing of close blood, he was run off the property with a shotgun leveled at his back. Eleanor, for her part, seemed oblivious, or perhaps she was simply determined to play the role her father had chosen for her. She wore her wedding band like a shield, and when asked about her children, she smiled in a way that felt rehearsed, as though she'd practiced it in the mirror 100 times. But even she couldn't control what was coming. The valley had been quiet for generations, but with each new child born to Thomas and Eleanor, the walls of that farmhouse began to feel less like a home and more like a sealed jar, the air inside growing thinner and darker. Because some bloodlines don't just keep secrets, they breed them. By the time the third child arrived, the valley had stopped pretending. It was the summer of 1939, and the war overseas was filling the radio with voices that spoke of distant horrors. But here, in the shadow of the Blue Ridge, there was a different kind of war, one waged behind closed doors against the very idea of what a family should be. His name was Joseph, though the neighbors called him Little Tom, because he had his father's heavy brow and his mother's narrow mouth. But he also carried something else, a stiffness in the way he moved, a strange gait that made him seem older than his years. The town doctor blamed it on developmental delays, though he didn't write that in his notes. Words like that had a way of traveling, and nobody wanted their name tied too closely to this family. Children from nearby farms were warned not to play too close to the valley road. Some obeyed. Others, driven by curiosity, would sneak near the edge of the property just to catch a glimpse of the strange siblings. They'd see Margaret staring back through the tall grass, or Samuel standing barefoot in the dirt, holding a rusted tin pail like he didn't quite know what to do with it. And sometimes they'd see Eleanor at the window, watching them with that same fixed, unnatural smile. In a small town, secrets rot quickly. The sheriff's wife once let slip, after too much whiskey, that the family's father, the man who'd insisted Thomas marry Eleanor, had been tending the garden of his own bloodline long before either of them were born. She said it like it was a sin passed down, inherited the way others inherit land or cattle. By the time Joseph turned 3, the whispers had shifted into something darker, not just about the marriage but about the children themselves. Illness seemed to cling to them. Samuel had seizures. Margaret's eyes twitched when she tried to read. And Joseph sometimes wandered the yard at night, humming to himself, his feet bleeding from walking in circles until the dirt was worn smooth. People stopped visiting entirely. The valley became a place you only passed if you had to, a quiet exile from the rest of the county. And inside that farmhouse, the walls held the sound of a family growing, not outward into the world, but inward, folding tighter and tighter until no daylight could reach them. But the story didn't end there, because the truth about what was happening inside that home was about to seep out and stain everything it touched. It was a letter that first let the outside world peek inside. In the winter of 1944, a school teacher in the nearest town received a folded note tucked between the pages of an old arithmetic book. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, but the words were deliberate. "We are not right. Please send someone." There was no signature, just a smudge where the paper had been gripped too tightly. The teacher brought it to the sheriff, who read it twice without speaking. He knew where the book had come from. Joseph had been given it by a traveling charity group the year before, but Joseph could barely write his own name, let alone this, which meant someone else in that house had slipped the message out. When the sheriff arrived at the farm, the air smelled of damp wood and kerosene. Thomas stood on the porch, his shotgun leaning against the wall, his eyes cold but calm. Eleanor emerged from the shadows behind him, her hands folded neatly, her smile as practiced as ever. They claimed not to know anything about a letter, and after a half-hour of tense conversation, the sheriff left empty-handed. But rumors grew teeth after that. The store clerk swore he saw Samuel buying salt and vinegar with coins so worn they looked older than the boy's grandfather. A mail carrier reported that Margaret had started coming to the end of the drive to collect the post, barefoot, even in the snow. And a farmhand from the next valley over claimed he'd seen Joseph in the barn, talking to someone who wasn't there. By spring, something had shifted. Thomas stopped coming into town entirely. Eleanor was seen only once, in a faded blue dress, walking the fence line like she was searching for something she'd lost. The children were thinner, quieter, almost ghost-like. Some believed the family was trying to disappear without leaving. Others believed they were already gone in every way that mattered, retreating into a world of their own making, one where the rules of kinship had been rewritten so many times that they no longer resembled anything human. But there are darker theories, the kind that suggest the letter wasn't a plea for help, but a warning, because sometimes what's trapped inside a house isn't trying to escape. Sometimes It's making sure nothing gets in. By the late 1940s, the family in the valley had become a story people told in hushed tones, the kind that grew stranger with each retelling, as if the truth itself was too fragile to survive in daylight. One boy from the next county claimed he'd crept up to the property on a dare. He said he saw Margaret hanging strips of cloth in the trees like warning flags, each piece marked with symbols he couldn't understand. Another swore he heard singing at night. Not the voice of one person, but of many, layered on top of each other, the same melody repeating over and over, like a prayer or a curse. Inside the farmhouse, the children were no longer children. Samuel, now a young man, had his father's heavy build, but carried himself with a strange stiffness, his head always tilted slightly as though he was listening to something just out of reach. Margaret was pale and wiry, her hair long and tangled, her eyes too old for her face. Joseph rarely spoke at all, but when he did, his words were clipped and deliberate, as though each one had to fight its way out. Visitors were non-existent, deliveries were left at the road. Even the preacher, whose duty was to tend to every soul in the county, stopped coming after a single winter visit when, as he later told his wife, it felt like the walls themselves were breathing. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? It was during this time that a traveling census taker came knocking. He was a small, polite man, used to rural suspicion, but when the door opened, he froze. Standing before him were Samuel and Margaret, and between them, a child. A girl no older than 3, her features an eerie blend of both. The census taker noted the names as given, Nora, but his handwriting wavered and he left the age column blank. Something in him understood that what he was seeing didn't fit into the neat lines of any government form. He left quickly, never returning to complete the paperwork, but he spoke of it in the next town, and that was enough. Word spread, not in full sentences, but in half-whispered fragments. Brother's child, sisters, the valley's got a new one now. The valley had always been a place apart, but now it was something else entirely, a living wound, hidden in the hills, festering quietly where no one dared to touch it. By the time Nora could walk, the family's history was collapsing in on itself. The elders in town, those who remembered the first generation of this bloodline, spoke of signs, not omens from the Bible, but from nature itself. Animals avoided the property. The crows would not perch on the barn roof. In winter, the snow seemed to melt faster there, leaving the ground wet and black, while the hills all around stayed white. Inside, the children of Thomas and Eleanor were no longer just siblings. They had become parents themselves. The line between brother and husband, sister and wife, had dissolved entirely. And with each new birth, the features of the family grew more alike, as if the valley itself were carving them into copies of one another. Nora was quiet, like her Aunt Mother Margaret, with the same watchful eyes. She rarely played, choosing instead to sit at the base of the old oak tree and hum a low, tuneless melody. When she spoke, it was often to herself. Sometimes the words she used were old-fashioned, even for the time, phrases that no one in the house should have known. The few who caught glimpses of the family during this period described an eerie sameness among them, a kind of mirror effect that unsettled the mind. Samuel, Joseph, Margaret, they moved alike, spoke in the same clipped rhythm, even tilted their heads at the same angle when listening. To the unprepared, it was like walking into a room of reflections that could breathe. There's a story, unverified but told often, about a fire one summer night. Supposedly, a lantern fell in the barn, setting the hay ablaze. The glow could be seen for miles, yet when neighbors arrived to help, they found the family standing in the yard in perfect silence, watching the flames consume their livelihood without a word. Only when the barn collapsed entirely did Thomas turn and lead them inside, shutting the door against the light. After that, the family withdrew even further. Curtains stayed drawn, voices rarely carried beyond the walls, and yet, on some nights, travelers passing through swore they heard a rhythmic thumping from deep inside the valley, a sound like footsteps, but too heavy and too steady to belong to any man. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening in that house was no longer just about kinship or even secrecy. Something older had taken root there, and it was growing. By the mid-1950s, the family's story had slipped almost entirely out of official record. The census stopped listing their names, school rosters showed no children from the valley. Even the county tax office carried only a vague notation beside the property line: unassessed, occupied. It was as though the paper world had decided to look away, letting the family vanish into the folds of the hills. But the land never forgot. Hunters reported strange tracks near the old creek, too wide to be deer, too narrow to be bear, moving in long, deliberate patterns. A railroad inspector claimed he heard voices in the fog one morning, low and layered, speaking in a language he couldn't place. When he tried to follow the sound, it stopped all at once, as if cut off mid-breath. By then, Thomas was an old man, his once towering frame bent but unbroken. Eleanor was thinner, her hair white, her smile faded but still fixed in that same unsettling curve. Samuel, Margaret, and Joseph now carried the household, their own children, 2 boys and a girl, rarely seen beyond the fence. And Nora, she had grown into something almost statuesque, her pale eyes glassy, her voice soft enough to make people lean in and regret it. One winter, a traveling photographer passed through, offering portraits for a small fee. He claimed he was invited inside the valley home, though no one else could confirm it. The photo he later displayed in a town 2 counties away showed the family gathered in their parlor, or what passed for one. Their clothes were outdated by decades, the wallpaper behind them peeling, the light in the room flat and cold. And yet, what unsettled people most wasn't the decay. It was their faces. Every one of them bore the same narrow jaw, the same set of the eyes, the same faint downward pull at the mouth. You could not tell where one bloodline ended and another began, because there was only one. The photographer left town quickly after that, claiming the air in the valley made him feel hollow. And within a year the house was found abandoned, dishes still on the table, beds unmade, a fire burned low in the stove, as if someone had left in the middle of supper. No one saw them leave, no one ever found where they went. Some say the family finally left the valley for good, scattering into places where their names would mean nothing. Others believe they're still there, deeper in the hills, where the road doesn't go, where the trees grow so close together you can't tell the shadows from the living. And if you ever find yourself out that way, and you see a pale-eyed woman watching from the tree line, don't wave. Because some bloodlines don't die. They just wait.